In 1920, deep in rural Virginia, authorities discovered a family of 14 people who hadn't left their property in over 30 years, and the genetic damage was visible on their faces. But what if I told you they're just one of 5 black families living this nightmare across American history? 5 black families. 5 generations of genetic isolation, all hidden by shame, racism, and silence. Behind America's most beautiful landscapes, from the Appalachian Mountains to Carolina's barrier islands to Louisiana's hidden bayous, families were trapped in genetic spirals that lasted over a century and a half. We found families with genetic markers more similar than full siblings, children born with conditions doctors had never seen, all because racism and violence made escape impossible. This isn't just one region. From Reconstruction-era islands to modern religious compounds, coast to coast, decade after decade, the pattern repeated. In the next 30 minutes, you'll see 5 documented cases, from island families cut off by Jim Crow violence, to religious communities that chose isolation, to freed slaves whose dream of freedom became a genetic prison. And here's what'll shock you. One of these families is still living this reality in 2025. They're suffering unlocked secrets that revolutionize genetics, but at a cost no community should ever pay. Unlike European royalty who married cousins for power, these black families were trapped by forces beyond their control. Slavery's legacy, Jim Crow terror, religious extremism, and isolation enforced by violence. We'll start with the families Virginia's government tried to erase from history, people whose very existence was made illegal. But first, hit subscribe right now. Drop your city in the comments. These stories need to be heard. Because this is American history they never taught you in school. 1 in 10 children born with 6 fingers. Another with pure white skin and pink eyes in an all-black community. 3 siblings who couldn't form words, only guttural sounds. This is Newman's Ridge, Tennessee, where America's racial purity laws created a genetic nightmare. Mixed-race families, black, white, Native American, declared legally invisible by Virginia's Racial Integrity Act of 1924. Not white, not black, not Indian. So who could they marry? The answer was each other, and only each other, for over a century. After Reconstruction collapsed in the 1870s, white supremacist violence drove these families into the mountains. The Ridge became their refuge, then their prison. By 1900, 80% of marriages were between first or second cousins. The Collins family alone had 3 sets of cousin marriages in 1 generation. 8 children, 5 with severe deformities, 3 dead before age 10. Virginia's anti-miscegenation laws made marrying whites illegal. Jim Crow terror made marrying into black communities dangerous. Geographic isolation, 40 miles to the nearest town over treacherous paths, made leaving impossible. But wait, it gets worse. The state knew about this, documented it, did nothing. Sarah Collins, born 1923. Her mother and father, first cousins. Her grandparents on both sides, siblings who'd married other siblings. Genetically, Sarah had less diversity than a child born from brother-sister incest. She was born deaf, blind in one eye, with a cleft palate that made eating agony. She wasn't alone. Albinism, which occurs in 1 in 20,000 births normally, appeared in nearly 1 in 10 Melungeon children. 6-fingered hands became so common, locals called it the Ridge blessing. Blessing. They called genetic deformity a blessing because they had no other way to cope. In 1932, a traveling photographer documented the community. The images shocked the nation. Children with misshapen skulls, adults who couldn't stand upright, families where every member showed visible genetic damage. The photographer wrote in his journal, "I have documented poverty across Appalachia. But this is something else entirely. This is what happens when America abandons its people." By the 1930s, researchers documented widespread learning disabilities, speech impediments, and developmental delays across the Ridge. But here's what they didn't document: how many children died before anyone could count them. Infant mortality rates 3 times the national average. Most causes listed as unknown or natural weakness. And this is only case number 1 of 5. Can you imagine what the next 4 families endured? In 1947, Johns Hopkins University finally took notice. Not to help, to study. Dr. James Morton arrived on Newman's Ridge with notebooks and cameras. He measured skulls, drew blood, documented every physical abnormality. The Collins family, the one that lost 5 of 8 children, let him examine the survivors. They thought help was coming. It wasn't. Dr. Morton's team discovered a coefficient of inbreeding of 0.25. In scientific terms, these children were genetically equivalent to offspring of full siblings. He identified previously unknown recessive disorders, including a rare blood condition now called Appalachian hemoglobin variant. His research revolutionized genetics, won awards, changed textbooks. The families got nothing. No medical intervention. No education about genetic risks. No help leaving the ridge. They were studied like laboratory specimens, then abandoned again. Dr. Morton published 17 papers on the Melungeons. Not once did he advocate for their care. But here's what's really disturbing. This wasn't unique. Across America, isolated Black communities were facing the same genetic collapse. And scientists knew. They documented. They published. They did nothing. A 1952 medical journal features photographs of Melungeon children alongside this caption: "Exceptional case study in human inbreeding effects." Exceptional, as if these were specimens, not children. One researcher wrote, "The Melungeon population provides invaluable data on genetic bottlenecks in isolated populations. Their continued isolation ensures future research opportunities. He was hoping they'd stay isolated, stay suffering, so he could keep studying." The Collins family's last surviving child, Ruth, lived until 1998. At her funeral, her grandson said, "Grandma Ruth used to ask why the doctors came but never helped. She died still wondering if it was because we weren't white enough or Black enough to matter." The Melungeon families reveal how America's racial caste system didn't just segregate, it genetically destroyed entire communities. Legal barriers, plus geographic isolation, plus medical neglect equals generational catastrophe. Today, fewer than 50 Melungeon descendants remain on Newman's Ridge. Most fled, some died out. The ridge is mostly empty now, but at least the Melungeons had some contact with the outside world. Had that traveling photographer, those researchers. However exploitative, they had witnesses. Our next family had absolutely none. Pause right now, drop a 1 in the comments if this case shocked you. Because what happened on a barrier island off the Georgia coast makes Newman's Ridge look like a blessing. For over 150 years, 3 interconnected Black families lived on Sapelo Island with 0 contact with mainland America. No boats. No roads, no escape. By 1920, every single child born on that island had parents who were at least second cousins. 89% were children of first cousins. And in 1923, 1 girl was born whose parents were so closely related, her genetic profile resembled incest. Her name was Sarah Bailey. She lived 19 years in agony. And her story, along with dozens of others from Sapelo Island, reveals how post-slavery freedom became a different kind of genetic prison. One enforced not by law, but by white violence so extreme that leaving the island meant death. What happened to Sarah Bailey and the families of Sapelo Island is next. And when you see what forced them into isolation, you'll understand why some wounds from slavery never healed. 89%. That's how many children born on Sapelo Island in 1920 had parents who were at least second cousins. The Melungeons were trapped by mountains and racist laws. The families of Sapelo Island, Georgia, were trapped by water and white violence. Newly freed in 1865, they thought they'd finally found freedom on this remote barrier island. How does freedom become a genetic prison? 47 black families. That's all who settled Sapelo after emancipation. They pooled money, bought land, built churches, preserved Gullah traditions carried from West Africa. This was supposed to be their new beginning. Within 50 years, genetic collapse. By 1900, everyone on the island was related. First cousins marrying first cousins, uncles marrying nieces. The gene pool shrinking with every generation. The Hall, Bailey, and Walker families, three of the largest clans, became so genetically entangled that separating bloodlines became impossible. Boats came twice a year, maybe. White landowners on the mainland controlled all access. No bridges, no schools, no medical care, no way out. Jim Crow didn't need walls when it had water, but wait, it gets worse. These families knew the risks. They begged for help. Nobody came. And this is only case number 2 of 5, Sarah Bailey. Born 1923. Her medical records tell a horror story. Parents, first cousins, maternal grandparents, siblings. Paternal grandparents, siblings who'd married other siblings. Genetically, Sarah had less diversity than a child born from brother-sister incest. The doctor who examined her at birth wrote, "I have never seen such severe genetic compression in a living child. She was born with a cleft palate so severe she couldn't eat solid food. Club feet that prevented walking. Profound deafness. Cognitive disabilities so extreme she never learned to communicate." Sarah lived 19 years, every day in pain, every day unable to understand why. A 1925 missionary report describes visiting Sapelo Island. Quote, "I have witnessed poverty across the South. But the children here, something is profoundly wrong. Physical deformities are common. Many cannot speak properly. Some cannot walk without assistance." The missionary requested medical intervention. The state of Georgia never responded. Between 1920 and 1950, infant mortality on Sapelo was 3 times the national average. Most death certificates listed natural causes or failure to thrive. Real cause, genetic disorders from generations of inbreeding. Dozens of children. Preventable deaths. Complete medical neglect. Can you imagine knowing your child is dying from genetic damage, and the only hospital is on a mainland you can't reach? But our next families were trapped by something even harder to escape: religion, pride, and the belief that their bloodline was too pure to mix with others. In rural Louisiana, a community of free people of color, wealthy, educated landowners, deliberately chose genetic isolation to preserve their pure Creole heritage. They weren't poor. They weren't uneducated. They weren't trapped by geography. They chose this. And the genetic consequences were just as devastating, maybe more so because they could have prevented it but didn't. The Metoyer family dynasty controlled thousands of acres and hundreds of enslaved people. But their obsession with bloodline purity created a genetic catastrophe that lasted 5 generations. And when you hear what they called the resulting disabilities, the Metoyer curse, you'll understand how denial can be just as deadly as oppression. Case 3 reveals what happens when pride becomes poison. And unlike the previous families who were trapped by forces beyond their control, the Louisiana Creoles had every opportunity to prevent their genetic collapse. They chose not to. And their descendants are still paying the price. 8 children from one mother, 3 dead before baptism, 2 born blind. And the church buried the records for 80 years. We just saw families trapped by geography and violence. But what if people chose their own genetic prison? Isle Brevel, Louisiana, 1830s. These weren't enslaved people. They were free, wealthy, educated. And they destroyed themselves from the inside out. Why? Pride killed them. The Creoles of color owned slaves themselves. They spoke French, attended Catholic Mass every Sunday. But America's racial caste system left them nowhere. Too black for whites. Too elite for other blacks. So they built their own world and their own rules about who could marry whom. Rule number 1. You marry Creole or you marry no one. 12 founding families in 1790. Just 12. By 1850, 300 people all sharing 12 surnames. The Catholic Church became the enforcer. Priests literally refused to perform marriages outside the community. One priest wrote in 1845, "Better they remain pure in blood than mongrelized in matrimony." Pure in blood. Listen to those words. That phrase sentenced children to death. The Metoyer family owned the most land, the most slaves, the most pride. Between 1820 and 1920, 100 years, over 90% of Metoyer marriages were to other Metoyers. Cousin to cousin to cousin. Generation after generation. By choice. But wait, here's where it gets darker. Louis Metoyer III. Born 1867. Both parents were Metoyers. His grandparents on both sides, first cousins. He married his own second cousin in 1890. They had 8 children. 3 died before their first birthday. 2 were born completely blind. 1 couldn't speak or walk. Only 2 lived past age 20, and both were sterile. The Metoyer line, one of Louisiana's wealthiest black families, ended because they refused to marry beneath themselves. By 1900, locals whispered about the Metoyer curse. They thought God was punishing the family's pride. But it wasn't God. It was genetics. And everyone in Isle Brevel knew it. The priest knew it. The doctors knew it. The families knew it. And they kept performing the marriages anyway. Drop a comment if you've heard of Isle Brevel before. Most people haven't. There's a reason why. Because what I'm about to show you was deliberately hidden for 8 decades. Catholic baptismal records from 1880 to 1920. Dozens of entries marked stillborn, died unbaptized, malformed, children born with skulls that didn't fully close, organs outside their bodies, limbs fused together. The church recorded every birth, every death, every deformity, then locked the books away. Preserving family honor was more important than saving children's lives, but you need to understand, this wasn't ignorance. The community had doctors. They had education. One doctor wrote to a medical journal in 1912, "The intermarriage practices will lead to genetic collapse within 2 generations." He was removed from his position at the church 3 weeks later. The community chose denial. They blamed demon possession, bad luck, sinful mothers, anything except the truth staring them in the face. By the 1930s, younger Creoles started fleeing to New Orleans, Baton Rouge, anywhere else. They were escaping 2 prisons, Jim Crow racism from whites, and genetic destruction from their own people. The ones who stayed watched their children die over and over. Can you imagine knowing your child's disabilities came from your own family tree? Knowing you had a choice, and you chose pride over their lives? That's what makes this case different. The Melungeons and Gullah Geechee had no choice. The Creoles did. And they chose wrong. We're only at case 3 of 5. And already we've seen isolation by law, by geography, by culture. Drop a 3 if this case shocked you most so far. But what happens when religious isolation doesn't just affect one community in the past? What happens when it's still happening right now? In rural Arkansas, there's a compound with 150 people. Most of them are related. All of them have been there since birth. And when medical authorities finally got inside in 1997, what they found was so disturbing. The CDC called it the worst case of genetic damage in modern American history. That story is next. And I need to warn you, this one is different. Because these people are alive today. Case 4, the compound. Still active. And some of them are trying to get out. 8 children who can't walk, talk, or feed themselves, and they're all alive right now. Less than 200 miles from where you might live, we've seen historical tragedies. But what if I told you it's still happening? Rural Arkansas, 2024. A religious compound with 150 people inside, How did America let this happen in the age of the internet? 1953. A man named Samuel Thompson claimed God spoke directly to him. He told 23 black families to follow him into the wilderness. They did. Thompson's message was simple. The outside world, even other black Christians, would corrupt their souls. He built fences, armed guards at the gate. No one leaves without permission. 23 families, roughly 100 people. That was the entire gene pool. For the next 70 years, those 100 people only married each other. But wait, this gets so much worse. By the 1970s, children started being born different. Limbs that didn't work right. Minds that developed slowly. The leadership didn't call doctors. They called it demonic possession. One former member later testified, "They told us the disabilities were punishment for hidden sins." Mothers blamed themselves. Fathers prayed harder. The children kept being born damaged. 1997. An anonymous call to Child Protective Services. Someone on the inside finally broke. When authorities entered the compound, they found 43 children. 17 had severe genetic disorders. 8 children, 8, had something called fumarase deficiency. Here's why that's terrifying. This condition is so rare, most doctors never see a single case. In the general population, it occurs once in every 200,000 births. In this 200-person compound, 1 in 25. That's 8,000 times more common than normal. Let that sink in. Drop a comment if you've ever heard of fumarase deficiency before. Most people haven't. Children with this condition can't process energy properly. Their brains don't develop. Most die before age 10. The ones who survive can't walk, can't speak, require 24-hour care. And in this compound, they blamed demons instead of genetics. Can you imagine being a mother in that community? Watching your child suffer, knowing something is wrong, but being told it's your fault for lacking faith? Between 1997 and 2015, social services tried 18 separate interventions. Medical professionals offered free genetic testing, free counseling, resources to help families leave. The community refused every single time. But here's the part that makes this truly disturbing. The leadership knew. They absolutely knew what was causing the disorders. In 2018, former members filed a lawsuit. Internal documents were subpoenaed. Leaders had medical reports from 2003 explaining the genetic risks in detail. They locked those reports in a safe, never told the families. One leader wrote in an email, "If they know the truth, they'll leave, and our community will die." So they let children be born sick, let them suffer, let some of them die, to preserve the community's existence. We're at case 4 of 5 now. Every case has been worse than the last, but this one is different because it's not history. It's happening right now. Today, there are roughly 150 people still in that compound. Some younger members have escaped. They're speaking out, trying to get their families out, but most stay, trapped by religious conviction, by family loyalty, by fear. And here's what keeps me up at night. There are probably other communities like this, ones we don't know about yet, because if this could happen for 70 years in America without intervention, what else is hidden behind fences and religious freedom laws? This is our most recent case. Drop a 4 if this shocked you most. But you need to understand our final family to see how all of this connects. Because what happened in Mississippi, right after slavery ended, created the blueprint for everything we've seen. A community called Freedom Hill, built by newly freed people in 1866. They thought they were building paradise. They bought land, built homes, created their own world. Within 60 years, genetic collapse would force them to abandon everything. And the reason why, the specific historical forces that trapped them, explain how systemic racism created genetic catastrophes that lasted generations. That story is next. And it's the most heartbreaking of all because they did everything right. They had freedom. They had land. They had hope. And America's racism still destroyed them from the inside out, in ways they never saw coming. 12 children born to one mother, 8 dead before age 5, and she never knew her family tree was killing them. We've seen compounds and religious isolation, but what if freedom itself became a trap? Freedom Hill, Mississippi, 1866. How did liberation lead to genetic extinction? The Civil War just ended. Slavery is abolished. 14 black families pooled everything they had. 400 acres in rural Jefferson County, Mississippi. They paid cash, legal ownership. They built homes with their own hands. A church, a one-room school. Everything they dreamed of during slavery, land, community, autonomy, was finally real. For about 9 years. By 1875, Reconstruction collapsed. White supremacist violence exploded across the South. Roads that were supposed to connect black settlements to towns, never built. Trade routes, mysteriously redirected away from black-owned land. The nearest black community was 40 miles away, through Ku Klux Klan territory. Leaving meant risking your life. Staying meant marrying your cousins. Those 14 founding families had no choice. They married each other. By 1900, just 35 years later, everyone in Freedom Hill descended from only 8 couples. 6 of the original 14 families had completely died out. 8 surnames. 200 people. All related. But wait, here's where the tragedy accelerates. Children born between 1895 and 1915 started showing patterns: blindness, deafness, minds that never fully developed. The Washington family, one of the founding families, respected, hardworking. Between 1905 and 1920, Mrs. Eliza Washington had 12 pregnancies, 12 children. 8 died before their 5th birthday. Pneumonia, the records say, fever, failure to thrive. But church records tell a different story. Drop a comment if you've ever researched your own family's medical history. Most people haven't. The Freedom Hill Baptist Church kept meticulous records: baptisms, marriages, burials. Between 1900 and 1925, they recorded 73 child deaths. Out of a population that never exceeded 200 people, 73 children dead. Born weak. Never thrived. Afflicted from birth. Over and over, the community didn't understand why. They thought it was God testing them. Can you imagine surviving slavery, buying your freedom, building a community, only to watch your children die from something you can't see or understand? By 1925, Freedom Hill's population dropped to 47 people. Most were too sick or disabled to farm the land their parents had fought for. The church stopped holding services. The school closed. The dream was dying. We're at our final case now. This is number 5 of 5. And this might be the cruelest story, because these people did everything right. They saved money, bought land legally, built infrastructure, created community. And American racism still destroyed them, not through direct violence, but through isolation. By cutting them off, white supremacy didn't just harm one generation, it damaged DNA. 1932. The last families abandoned Freedom Hill. They left everything: homes, land, the church, the graveyard with 73 small graves. They scattered to Memphis, Chicago, Detroit, anywhere else. For decades, Freedom Hill was forgotten, erased from county records, no historical markers. White historians wrote Mississippi's history. Black settlements didn't make the books. But here's what haunts me about this case. In 2004, a genealogist researching her family stumbled onto church records in a Memphis attic. She found the whole story: names, dates, the genetic collapse documented in real time. When she presented her findings to medical geneticists, they were stunned. One researcher said, "This is a textbook example of a genetic bottleneck, and it was engineered by racism." Think about that. Engineered by racism, not accidental, not natural. Deliberately created through systematic oppression, Freedom Hill isn't just a story about genetics. It's about what happens when you trap people, when you cut off access to healthcare, education, other communities. Genetics becomes a weapon even without anyone pulling a trigger. This is our final case. Drop a 5 if this one hit you hardest. But you need to understand what connects all 5 of these families, because everything we've seen, from the Melungeons to Freedom Hill, reveals one truth. Systemic racism doesn't just harm individuals. It damages biology. It creates conditions where DNA itself becomes corrupted across generations. And the consequences last longer than any law, any policy, any single act of violence. 5 families, 5 different circumstances, mountains, islands, bayous, compounds, settlements, but one common thread: isolation caused by racism created genetic catastrophe. These weren't ignorant people making bad choices. They were intelligent people trapped by systems, trapped by anti-miscegenation laws, Jim Crow violence, religious persecution, economic control. They're suffering advanced genetic science. We learned about inbreeding coefficients, recessive disorders, population bottlenecks, but that knowledge cost them everything. Today, genetic counseling exists. Testing is available. We can prevent these tragedies, but only if people have access: healthcare, education, economic mobility. The same barriers that trapped these 5 families still exist in isolated communities today. Both Black and white communities in rural areas face limited healthcare access. The solution hasn't changed. Break isolation, provide resources, ensure genetic diversity. Which case impacted you most? Drop the number 1 through 5 in the comments right now. If this documentary revealed history you never learned in school, hit that subscribe button. We're uncovering stories mainstream media won't tell, stories that textbooks ignore. And we can't do it without your support. This is part 1. Part 2 will explore the science deeper. The medical interventions that finally helped some families, the survivors who escaped, and the descendants living today, still processing what their ancestors endured. Subscribe so you don't miss it. These families' stories matter. The Melungeons, the Gullah Geechee, the Creoles, the compound survivors. Freedom Hill, their suffering must not be forgotten, because when we forget how systemic racism damages communities at the genetic level, we risk letting it happen again. Thanks for watching.